anyway, it's an enormous pleasure to introduce Darren Coppin. Darren is one of these extraordinary people who's managed to not only do psychology, do interesting things, but really get into the policy and the delivery of the ideas that he's been working with. And you'll hear some amazing things. We first met not that long ago at a conference in Adelaide, because, again, as you may know, South Australia has taken a real interest in positive psychology and well-being and has declared themselves a state of well-being. And they really see well-being as their mission. And so we were both there at a conference and met and got on, and actually got on so well that Darren is going to be a PhD student here, supervised by Joseph and myself. So although he's been out in the real world and already done the equivalent of several PhDs, we're going to welcome him to ACU. Anyway, you're in for a treat. Thanks, Darren.
How to set me up. I will now speak in a monotone for 40 minutes. Sorry. Thanks for all coming along. Notwithstanding the title of the talk, I'm a great advocate, of course, of positive psychology. Not because of any inherent conviction or attachment to it as an ethos, as a movement, but because of the results I've seen the science achieve with governments, with corporations, and with my own family, I guess. So if you've got any questions during the talk, of course this is quite, semi-informal, so just shout out or abuse me or heckle, whatever you want, challenge anything you fancy. And then, of course, I'll try and complete it within 30 minutes so you've all got good time to have your lunch and ask questions, that sort of thing as well. Good. Now, look, you'll probably all be familiar. Let me just set the timer so that I don't waffle on too much. Self-discipline and self-regulation. You're probably all familiar with this statement from Marty Seligman at the 2011 APA conference. He set the aim, the mobilising aim, of having 51% of the world flourishing by 2051. He went further to say that it's in our hands not just to witness this, but to take part in making it happen. The trouble is, 4 years after that was set, just 4 years into this 40-year movement or aim, I've got a despairing feeling that 51% flourishing is in danger of floundering. And this talk is really about why that seems to be, what signals I've been receiving from government. And it offers some insights as to what we can do about it, not from me, but from intelligent people, some really key people in our movement. Conversations with people like Robert Biswas-Diener, Barbara Fredrickson, Carol Dweck, etc. Now look, ground-up movements, and we must face a lot of positive psychology is from the ground up, are absolutely essential and usually more successful in mobilising people. But it's my proposition that we can't reach anywhere near 51% of the world flourishing by 2051 without the engagement of government. We need policymakers to work with us if we are to get anywhere near that improvement in well-being and life satisfaction. Now, the government really has contact with and channels of intervention with its citizens through 5 main routes. First of all is education, and of course positive education is perhaps one of the best, most publicised and well-measured ways positive psychology is making a difference on a large scale. Next, we've got healthcare. We've not been so great with that. PermaPlus might start to address that a little bit, addressing eating habits, fitness habits, etc. Cognitive behavioural therapies made great inroads in Britain, but I think there's great opportunity for positive psychology within healthcare. And for measurement there. You'll be aware of some projects. The armed forces is another way the government can interact with the masses, millions of people in the case of the US Army. So comprehensive soldier fitness is the world's largest implementation of positive psychology, or the Penn Resiliency Programme. Then we've got justice, which we were just touching upon very briefly. The government has an opportunity to intervene with people in prisons, people on probation, offenders, etc., to reduce recidivism. So there's a great opportunity there, I think, for positive psychology, which we'll start to examine. And then welfare. In pretty much every Western nation, welfare is the largest budget by far for every government. usually about 30% of all government expenditure. Not all on the unemployed, a huge proportion of that goes on pensions, etc. But welfare is my particular specialism. Looking after the unemployed, there are sort of three different categories of unemployed: your general unemployed, your youth unemployed, and your disabled unemployed. So what I've been doing over the last, I guess 17 years is working with the unemployed and finding ways of getting them back to work. Effective, fast ways that don't then diminish after, say, you put somebody in a room like this and give them 2 or 3 days of training, and they're all motivated and optimistic, and then 2 or 3 days later it's gone down again. In fact, some of Ed Diener's best work and research that I've read relates to life satisfaction and the set point of life satisfaction, which some of you might have heard of this. Say you win the lottery, you're generally this sort of level of life satisfaction. Your happiness or life satisfaction shoots up, then it plummets again as people start creeping out of the woodwork asking for money, or the legal side kicks in, all the ex-wives, etc. And then it kind of settles back at what your previous level of life satisfaction was. So there's this set point of life satisfaction. In the context of unemployment, what they found with 25,000 Germans in a big study he undertook is that if a man is made redundant, it takes him 5.1 years to return to his previous set point of life satisfaction, even if he gets a job within 6 months of initially being made redundant. 5.1 years. Now, to put that in context, it takes him 4.9 years to overcome the death of his life partner, or his wife, perhaps. So, it's very embarrassing. So look, we had a hunch that improving the resilience of the unemployed might increase their likelihood of even trying to get a job. We had a hunch that maybe improving their well-being, using some examples from the Penn Resiliency Programme, using some core positive psychology interventions, we might be able to increase the number of unemployed getting back to sustainable work. We also had a feeling, though, that we shouldn't implement this with everybody. Say somebody's already really up for getting a job, they're unemployed, they really want to get back to work. If we then took them and put them through a number of positive psychological workshops or interventions, it might alienate them if they're already in what you might call the action stage of change. So actually we approached and worked with the University of Rhode Island, Dr. Prochaska there, who is behind the trans-theoretical model of change, or a stage of change model, where you can measure whether somebody's in the action stage of change. They really want to, in their context, usually it's giving up smoking, or whether they're a pre-contemplator, absolutely no intention at all of giving up smoking. What they've done since the early 80s is been able to refine what was, I think, a 96-item survey to establish somebody's genuine readiness to change. They've got it down to 12 questions. And we worked with them to put that online, so it didn't take 20 minutes or so to score this questionnaire, so it was scalable with large numbers of the unemployed. There were two things implementing this stage of change measurement. In other words, all we're asking is, do you want a job? Yes, no, or maybe. But of course, humans don't answer in any sort of real clarity with that, or any real truth. So this is why the stage of change 12 questions measurement is so important. So what we did was we actually, by implementing this with 100 people initially up in Bundaberg, and then we've now had almost 70,000 unemployed Australians, Brits and Americans go through this survey in the last 3.5, 4 years. We uncovered two things that were pretty profound, to quote Queensland's chief scientist. First of all, it's that blue section there, unauthentic action. This is something that doesn't exist where the stage of change model or survey is implemented elsewhere, which is usually with addictive behaviours, such as giving up smoking, giving up drugs, or even with increasing attendance at mammography screenings. You know, are you really committed to turning up and to addressing this? You don't get, unauthentic action is basically where, in the context of the unemployed, you're taking all the actions to get a job. You're attending your appointments at an employment service company, you're sending off applications, you've improved your CV, you're going on a barista course or a forklift driving course to genuinely try and get a job, you're turning up at interviews, you might even get the job. But those same people are scoring highly on pre-contemplation as well. They've got absolutely no intention at all, or desire or confidence of getting and holding down a job. These are two completely contradictory things. They're doing all the actions to get a job, no intention at all of getting a job. As they were called in the Department of Employment recently when I described this trait, they're bullshitters. And unfortunately, there's a strong bias towards men in this. So it's largely made up of men. But this is fascinating. You've got 20% of individuals that you'd think are really trying to get a job, and you do everything you can to support them, and yet they keep on dropping out of interviews or dropping out of work very quickly. This is absolutely essential for a government to understand in order to formulate policy to try and get people into work and stay there.
And is that because they don't get any money if they don't turn up? Is that the reason?
Yes, there's two things. Sanctions. We think, we haven't studied it properly, but in working with University of Rhode Island, it's coercion. If they don't do it, they don't get their payments, yeah, exactly, their benefits payments. It might also be the bias towards men probably correlates with other studies that say men have a huge attachment to the job is them, and that's what they do. If they don't have a job, they've lost a lot of, so they've got to be seen to be trying to get a job, seen to be working strongly towards it, more than perhaps a lady might do, just for appearances. But really inside, he's lacking confidence. He's a contemplator, yeah, maybe in 6 months' time, or a pre-contemplator, no, don't want a job. Either because their confidence and sense of control is shattered inside, or they're quite happy working down the market or getting cash in hand doing other bits and bobs as well. So you can see there's a bit of complexity in everything we're dealing with the unemployed. But from the first 100 people we put through this stage of change survey to the 70,000th person that we put through it, there's been this consistency of a 1/3, 2/3 split of those in action, optimistically, genuinely trying to get a job, and the others who might be lacking a little bit of confidence, the preparers, yes, I really want a job, but I'm not sure how to go about it, I'm not confident yet, I need to work with you to build my interview skills, etc., through to the other stages of change. This 1/3, 2/3 split. And interestingly, it exactly correlates with the learned helplessness splits across all animal species, from a goldfish and a cockroach to a German shepherd to babies. That is, if you are continually faced with a situation or an adversity over which you seem to have no control, you give up. Or 2/3 of the species give up. They conserve energy, they curl up, they avoid as a human embarrassment of keeping trying and failing. So what we find interesting with this is that it means that you've got 2/3 of the population the unemployed population not trying to get a job. Does that mean that these dole bludgers aren't evil, nasty, manipulative human beings, shirkers, but they're acting in exactly the same way as the entire animal kingdom does? They're actually learned helpless. Now, interestingly, these experiments started in 1968 in terms of learned helplessness, led by the US or funded by the Department of Defense and led by Marty Seligman back then. So, what do you do if somebody has learned helplessness? And the beauty of finding that correlation, again, it might not be causation, but if you look at the symptoms of learned helplessness and you look at a lot of our long-term unemployed, it's almost textbook exactly the same, the issues that they're facing or the behaviours that they exhibit. So we've got 40 years of science to how to avoid or protect against or move somebody out of learned helplessness, and a lot of that comes down to positive psychological interventions, resilience interventions, mental toughness interventions, well-being interventions, however you want to brand it. So what we did, you'll be familiar with a lot of these. I asked for 12 weeks with each cohort of unemployed people in that first project we had in Bundaberg, and I wanted to take them through these sorts of things. Strengths, where we've been directly informed by people like Ryan Niemiec at the VIA Institute, Robert Biswas-Diener with some of his coaching interventions. Positivity, a lot of Barb Fredrickson stuff. Mental toughness, which is really CBT, the Albert Ellis stuff that originally helped to inform some of the early positive psychology. Mindset, Carol Dweck stuff. You're in control of what you're good at or what you choose to work at and what have you. And then finally, character and goals. You'll be familiar with all the sorts of 32 different interventions we do in there. I asked for 12 weeks. They gave me 5 half-day sessions with a group of unemployed people to try and move them forward. So I thought, my God, how am I going to squeeze everything into that and still be effective? But if it wasn't, as an experiment, as a study, that would be just as interesting if it didn't work. This is Amanda and Brendan. They're generationally unemployed, as the government would term them. They're unemployed, their brothers and sisters are unemployed, their parents are unemployed, even their children are unemployed. That kid would be up a chimney in London, working for his living. They live in Bundaberg, branded to me as the toothless city. It's not that bad when I actually went there. I think it's all the sugar up there. They were one of the first 100 families that went through this program, where we first assessed whether they really wanted a job or not. We used our stage of change assessment. Those 2/3 that weren't truly committed or confident or desired to get a job, we put through the 5 resilience workshops. And the results we achieved with these first 100 families were better than anything else achieved in 5 other FSET programs, they were called, family-centred or generationally unemployed programs. In fact, they were better than by 50% in terms of outcomes, the number of people getting a job. In half the time, this was only a year's project, where the others were 2-year-long projects. And uniquely, Bundaberg at the time, this was 2011 when we did this, Bundaberg had steeply rising unemployment, whereas all of the other locations, such as Goodna, Elizabeth, etc., had decreasing unemployment. So this was a remarkable finding, a remarkable project. In fact, so interesting and got a little bit of publicity in the employment services industry that we got funding for 1,000 people to go through this program. We assessed, then implemented our Welfare Applied Positive Psychology program, WAP we called it, very nice and easy. Those 1,000 people working with Employment Services Queensland, we got world-leading increases in people getting a job. So that was very pleasing, and we started to get funding from other private companies using government money to try and get people back to work, employment service companies, and we got enough funding for 10,000 people to go through this program by 2013, early 2013. And the government loved this. Julia Gillard, when she was head of the department responsible for employment, DEWA, she got Marty Seligman, Karen Rivich over at the same time they were training at Geelong Grammar. She put about 200-300 of the DEWA, the government department staff, through their resiliency program. They loved it. They liked anything to do with applied positive psychology, so my program, obviously, they lapped it up. Whenever I went back and provided them with this data, they were so pleased to see it working. But by 2013 early, I'd say, well, the WAP program, we've started working with the next cohort, 5,000 people. The outcomes are looking good. Shall I come and present and show you the differences between men, women, age groups, etc.? Suddenly, they weren't so interested. They weren't so excited or engaged in WAP. Welfare Applied Positive Psychology. And I couldn't put my finger on it. And I think it's down to what I'll cover in the next few slides. This is the same conference, the American Psychological Association 2011 conference, when Marty Seligman set the 51% flourishing target. And he was reporting on a British program with 21 comprehensive schools that had put children through a positive education program, if you like. And what he uncovered was, in 21 replications, when the teachers learned positive psychology intervention skills and how to teach them to kids, it significantly lowered depression, it lowers anxiety and bad conduct. And the kids who had the positive psychology literature courses were rated by their teacher as having higher social skills. Their zest for learning is higher. This is also positive, and almost as an afterthought, their grades are better. Now, speaking of that conference, we were in the Wellbeing Symposium and what have you last February in Adelaide. Marty said that, this isn't Marty, he's had a shave and grown some hair. No, this is Michael Gove, the British Secretary of State for Education at the time of those 21 comprehensive schools going through this program. And the results were measured by the London School of Economics, and Marty met with him, and he said last year, Michael Gove doesn't really like all this positive education stuff. Why would we waste money building character, happiness and meaning when what we want is numeracy and literacy? You know, it's almost like you can hear the boos and hisses in a pantomime at this fella. Ooh. But let's cut Michael Gove a bit of a break. He's a senior minister and the role he has is usually pretty short term. Not long after this, he was then had his role changed to Chief Whip, which is actually a bit of a demotion from Secretary of State for Education, but in the new Conservative government, he's been promoted again. So he does the jobs on average every 2 years. Most senior ministers hold down a job for every 2 years, and they're judged on their results, whatever the results might be. For the Department of Education, the results almost without exception are, how are the grades going? Are grades going up for the same amount of money or for less expenditure, particularly at the moment with austerity measures in a lot of Western nations. And of course, he's under intense media scrutiny with everything he does. So you can understand why he might not want to say to the media, well, we've increased the character and happiness. I know grades have gone down and it costs more, but... So he's got to be very careful with what he says, and that's why he might not like this positive psychology stuff so much, according to Marty. This led me to do a quick Google search.
Yeah. So did you say grades went down?
No, they didn't, no. But he'll be held accountable, yes. Let me make that clear. Grades did not go down. They actually improved somewhat. But it was the last thing mentioned in the reports, and from what I can gather in meetings, when actually it's the most important thing for people like Michael Gove. And when we do a Google search, Google Images search, for policy makers, the people we have to engage with to stand any chance, I believe, of reaching 51% of world flourishing by 2051, the images that come up on page 1 for policy makers are these. You know, as you might expect, people in suits sitting around tables, talking interminably, or this sort of thing, you know, balancing finances, etc. When I do a similar page 1 Google Images search for positive psychology, the images I get are these. And I have no idea what the frog is there for. But you can see there's an absolute mismatch between the image and branding, if you like, of positive psychology and policymakers, the people we need for positive psychology to reach its absolute real aim and goal, if you like. I mean, the frog, I don't know why it's there. It does look strangely familiar. Pathetic. 7 hours that took for me to merge those. Complete waste of time. Anyway, there's something else as well in the etymology, the meaning or the foundation of words that we're using. Flourish 51 is our motivating and mobilising goal. But flourish comes from the Latin that means to flower, to bloom, to blossom, which also means it's quite a temporary thing. It will die. It's flowery. Richard Layard's recent book was called Thrive, and it's a word I much prefer to use with government policy makers, ministers and department members, because thrive comes from the Old Norse, which means to grasp. It comes from the same root as the word thrift. And what policy maker doesn't want to be associated with things like thrift? So you can see there's a very different branding, if you like, terminology being used. Finally, really, there's one other key point. The interest and fascination in well-being, life satisfaction, measurement, and positive psychology, I guess. This is, you don't really have to make this out too much. It's just the official data from the United States. The top chart is unemployment, and you can see it going up very steeply in 2008 to 9. And the bottom, whether you like it or not, GDP as a rubbish measure of national flourishing, if you like, went down significantly in the GFC, or the Great Recession, as they call it in America. That was the time when suddenly Marty Seligman was being asked into places like the Cabinet Office, number 10. When Ed Diener was having great input with Obama's administration, if you like, or Washington. And that was the time when you have to consider a government gets voted in pretty much regularly on how it's performing economically in terms of unemployment and national not well-being, but national productivity, GDP. That's what makes a government get voted in, regardless of which government it is. The Conservatives, Probably everybody kind of hates them a little bit in Britain, but the economy's not doing so bad. We don't want to mess with that just in case. So they get voted in again. That's when they didn't have that argument, when unemployment's going up and GDP's going down, well, how is a government going to get voted back in? They have to use the argument, yes, well, money's important, I know, but well-being, your happiness is more important to us. That's what we're focusing on, and that's what we can measure, and that's what we can show has increased. Perhaps it's a voting fallback plan, a safety net to try and get voted back in. But as soon as the economy picks up again post-2010, suddenly the interest seemed to wane a little bit more within government on falling back on well-being, life satisfaction, and positive psychological measures and interventions. Suddenly the interest and drive wasn't so intense. So maybe it's just a voting thing within governments. And Barb Fredrickson, author of Love 2.0 and Positivity, she says, when I'm in Washington speaking with policymakers, I have to be pragmatic. We need to be pragmatic. I don't talk about, well, to really increase people's likelihood of doing things, having this behavioural change that you're trying to implement with this policy, we need to increase the amount of love, joy and awe that they feel, the sort of things she writes about in her book. She says we need to be pragmatic in the language we use to engage with policymakers. And let's have a quick look at the largest implementation of the Penn Resiliency Programme, positive psychology. 1.1 million US Army soldiers have been through comprehensive soldier fitness and their families. And the initial data showed that soldiers who get this training experience less catastrophic thinking, exhibit better coping skills, ultimately lower post-traumatic stress disorder. They have better reintegration into society. They're less likely to commit crime, be unemployed, etc. It costs, the figures vary greatly. We know it costs a good $50 million a year. I think the first year might have been about $178 million to implement this program. And there's lots of meta-analysis and studies on, is it effective? Is it, if you start working on a new recruit or existing soldiers, are we lowering their post-traumatic stress disorder? Are they reintegrating into society better? And the different studies show different things. So why would a government, the Department of Defense, carry on investing this amount of money? And that was a confusion. If we had that much funding for some of our programs, I think we'd all be very happy. Now, I got some sort of answer from Rhonda Cornum. So she's just retired, but Brigadier General Rhonda Cornum spent some time on a farm in Kentucky in October. And it was only after some of her own blend Woodford Reserve bourbon that she actually got to telling me what perhaps is the reason why the Department of Defense is still investing that amount of money when the results are inconclusive. She said, look at it this way, Darren, there are 130,000 recruits a year to the US Army, and it costs us about $88,000 recruitment cost per person. That's almost $11.5 billion in terms of recruitment, basic training, etc. Now, within 2 days of having our upfront global assessment tool and then Penn Resiliency Programme, we can tell those who are most likely to drop out. We can identify, look, this probably isn't for you, or those that are in danger in the bottom quarter that might drop out, we can say, well, let's do these different interventions, these different resilience interventions. And quite often from the studies I've read, they end up outperforming the other 70% of people that have normal or higher levels of mental toughness. But if they can reduce the attrition rate, the dropout rate by just 5%, it saves the American Department of Defense $572 million a year. That's an 11-fold return on investment for that $50 million a year of investment in what is really a positive psychology program. So you can suddenly see why the government's adopting this. And it's not the obvious things. I started working with this team in the Cabinet Office in Britain, the Behavioural Insights team that some of you may have heard of before. A couple of them have moved over here to New South Wales as well.
And they gave a talk here at the Brown Bag.
Oh, was it Rory?
No, it was Alex.
Oh, was it? Okay. So, yeah, they won't come next Friday. So anyway, I'm still trying to attract you out to get your cocktail at the Friday event. So the Behavioural Insights team are so popular. It's the mot du jour, the word of the day almost in many government departments. Behavioural science, behavioural insights. Because they use interventions that are pretty much a lot of them have their roots in positive psychology. And yet their popularity's gone up and up and up within government departments, whereas positive psychology, I propose, might have plateaued or even gone down the interest there to some extent. But what they do so well is brand their interventions in terms of how much money this has saved you as a government, how much less per outcome it's costing you to implement this scientifically informed intervention. They use it with tax interventions, things like electricity, and where we got into contact was with the unemployment interventions as well. There was a lot I could learn from these because my business, my studies were decreasing in intensity and interest within the government. So then I started looking at behavioural science, reading a lot of books. The real key book is the Nudge book by Thaler and Sunstein, and really learn these three things. You know, do humans act for net gain? Does Homo economicus really exist? These are Homo economicus, Dr. Spock, is what most policy is formulated on. If we do this, our population, our citizens will act logically and they'll change their behaviours and use less electricity, or they'll go to doctor checkups more often, or whatever the policy objective is. But the problem is we don't. Humans act in three key ways that determine how we act. Now, of course, ad agencies and supermarkets have known this since the 50s, or implemented this. But we do whatever's easiest. We do whatever we can to impress others. We're a social animal, so we try, and almost everything we do, we wear, we act is to impress others, or at least avoid embarrassment. It's my key driver. And self-control. We have terrible self-control. We're all familiar with the marshmallow experiments and studies, the Haribo ads. And interestingly, in 3 million people undertaking the VIA character strength survey, where it ranks your 24 strengths, the lowest across 3 million people in every country on earth, no matter what the culture, is self-control, self-regulation. Of course, Aristotle, 2,500 years ago, wrote that basically, to be the epitome of human character excellence, you don't have to exhibit a huge amount of bravery or courage or leadership. They're not the most important virtues. It's self-control, he wrote. So he knew that 2,500 years ago, but we've just got the results in the last couple of years. So look, what we need to deal with is my kind of brain, a Homer Simpson brain in policy formulation. But that's the core of policy formulation and behavioural science. That's what we need for it to be effective. So look, just to really conclude on the next couple of slides with this, I changed the branding of what we were doing from applied positive psychology to applied behavioural science, from app to abs. And I started to marketing, not in terms of the things I was measuring. Look at what we're doing with our unemployed. We're reducing their levels of anxiety, stress and depression, which in the long term and disabled unemployed are as high as returning servicemen and women from theatres of war. We're increasing their well-being perhaps. I stopped measuring and quoting in terms of that. I started saying, taking lessons from the Behavioural Insights team. We've increased by 19% the number of people getting a job in the next 6 months, those who have been through this programme compared to controls. Now, 12% is considered world leading, so 19% was great. But after 9 months, we were achieving 54% increases in those getting work. Amongst the long-term unemployed, we were doubling the number that was still in those jobs 3 months later. In fact, for the government, you can pinpoint a 15-fold return on investment. Every dollar they spend on this applied behavioural science, what's really applied positive psychology program, every dollar you spend on that, you're saving $15 or making $15 in terms of higher taxes from people working and lower benefits payments. So it's very easy to pinpoint. And then suddenly we got people like Queensland's chief scientist, the ex-head of the CSIRO, looking at this program and calling it profound. People in the department were calling it unprecedented, talking to the British Department of Work and Pensions and California's government, rating this program. And we had people that run employment service companies, the people that are implementing this government policy, calling the whole model game-changing. So what we were able to do is reach many thousands more Brendan and Amandas. We were able to not ebb away and just die off at 10,000 people. This year we should reach between 100 and 250,000 people in 4 different countries. And really it was all down to that change in terminology, that pragmatism. And probably with this talk that's 32 minutes long, so there's a little bit of waffle, so I'll have to tighten that up. But can we achieve it? You'll probably only remember 2 or 3 things from it, you know, what a human brain's like. So it might be, my fear, hopefully I've instilled you with my fear, that we won't be able to achieve 51% by 2051 unless we engage with government. The fact that we need pragmatism in our terminology and talk the same language as the government, not about meaning and happiness all the time, certainly not at the top, but in what's important to them, cost and outcomes in terms of, it might be getting people into work or higher numbers of people getting their English and maths exams, or it might be behavioural science and nudge. We can start branding ourselves as part of that whole movement as well, which I know many of you already started to do. But the bottom line for me is that improving lives and delivering fiscal financial returns needn't be mutually exclusive, but it mustn't be mutually exclusive if we are to achieve that 51% flourishing by 2051. So you were very disciplined with your questions, except for you. But that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Darren. Anyone? Comments, questions?
I totally buy the argument, but I also think we need to change the language as well. And do you have any comments about that? Like, we can play along with the... I'm thinking particularly of the words, say, meaning and well-being and so forth. I think one thing that positive psychology has done is put that a little bit more on the agenda, and, you know, things like national well-being indices and so forth have done that even more because governments understand that type of index. So to a certain extent, we're also about changing the language as well, aren't we? How does one do that?
Yeah, I mean, well-being's the perfect example in point. We know scientifically that if you improve well-being, you improve engagement, you improve economic contribution to a society, you improve health, etc. It's absolutely essential. The only problem is you have well-being magazines that are talking about certain things that don't fit well with serious, boring government ministers. You know, it's about eating the right thing or meditating correctly. And the trouble is, meditation, we all know, scientifically proven to have enormous benefits in almost every aspect of life. But that pragmatism's not there if we're to engage certain members. So that's why I like Thrive, because it's got that thrift thing, and it's all about thriving. But yeah, the seriousness, a lot of the work you've done in particular has meant that well-being is credible with governments as something you can start to measure as well and drive towards as a policy outcome. But suddenly you don't get Cameron nor even the Cabinet Office talking about it as much as they were 2 or 3 years ago. So we can slip it in, and if you look at all of the great drivers in our industry, from the Layards to the Seligmans to the Dieners, to even the Jim Cliftons at Gallup, they've all done it from this change and this adoption from within. They've been part of the establishment or got into the establishment and then changed it. And I just fear that often we're in danger of trying to do it from without or ground up, because that's what engaged us in this movement and this science in the first place. So you're right, there's a huge amount of improvement over the last 5 years, and I think we just need to keep focused.
Darren, you used the example of how Julia Gillard at the time was, when she was, I guess, Minister of Department of Employment and Education, had a great interest, and I know, what was her name, Christine Paul, the Secretary, was very interested.
Oh, yeah.
I'm just wondering how much the experience that you had of less interest was just the politics of Julia, all of that turmoil that happened.
Yeah, that's a good point. Were the people in the department interested in WAP because Julia Gillard was, and it was a cool thing to be interested in at the time? Were they genuinely interested or engaged with it? Is that kind of your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and because she lost power, so
suddenly they're not so interested because it was her.
Yes,
yeah.
And my experience links to the work that I've done with the government, and we were supported by Peter Garrett at the time to develop the National Safe Schools Framework, which we use as a framework for whole school wellbeing. But as soon as the Libs came in, you don't get the same support for something that was initiated by the previous government.
Yes, yeah, no matter what it was.
No matter how good it is.
They wouldn't do. And it doesn't sit right necessarily with a blue government as compared to a red government, whether you're in America, Britain, France,
exactly.
or over here. Because of the terminology. Now, say Labour win in the next term in Britain, or you know, they win over here at the next election, suddenly I think we can probably start saying things like well-being and positive psychology again, and having a huge amount of engagement. Having said that, the civil servants that fund and implement whatever the ministers say are the same, no matter which people at the top come and go every 2 years. So there is, when I spoke with them, and I must have met with 20 different people within the Department of Employment, they genuinely were into it. They oh really? And they sat up and leant forward when I was saying, oh, we've got an applied positive psychology program. And they said, oh great, we've been trained in this, but there's not much we can do sitting in our office in Canberra, but to see it out there making differences to Brendan and Amanda's lives is wonderful. But genuinely as well, with that change of government, that filtered down a bit, and they weren't so excited or interested when I called it positive psychology. So yeah, there is an element of that.
Probably a number of factors.
Yeah, and there's a stickability within the actual civil servants, but behavioural science, they'll lap it up. And ours is a wonderful behavioural science, so that's what I use to brand Matt.
So it sounds like a lot of the language makes a difference. How do you find a language that connects with civil servants, or you know, school teachers or coaches?
Copying. But chatting mostly with the behavioural insights team and meeting with them. And they're so in demand, they couldn't keep up with demand and meetings. They had a conference over here and you hosted them for breakfast that they thought would be a couple of dozens people. It was a couple of hundred people turned up. And there's a fascination which cemented my trepidation and fears, but also acceptance that, yeah, they're just talking about results, outcomes, they're talking ministerial language, they're talking Oxford, Cambridge graduates informing this. So there was a lot more credibility, but it was the flavour that the government found palatable, if you like, rather than me talking about depression, anxiety and stress, or in that case, behaviour, in the case of education, you know, behaviours, happiness and meaning and character. They don't care, they just want results first, then you can talk about the side effects.
Yeah, thanks for a fascinating presentation. I enjoyed that thoroughly. Yeah, I understand I agree with you with the following on what you were saying, the power of words and language and images and that. For example, these days we'll buy KFC, but we wouldn't buy Kentucky Fried Chicken because it's so unhealthy. But KFC's a lot better for you. But I've always I do grasp and appreciate positive psychology. I think it's great. I've always had a little bit of reservation with the word thrive myself. It can, much like flourish, and you pointed out that thrive is a bit better, but thrive does sort of sometimes sound over the top when you're going to say, you know, the people will be thriving. Have you ever thought of that, or has anyone else said, you know, thrive is a little bit over the top? I mean, yes, we do want people thriving, but...
I've not, but when I'm chatting to people, one of the great strengths of most people involved in positive psychology is their empathy and being able to read and tell how other people are responding to what they're saying. So I'll just do it as I'm talking with various, you know, it might be a minister or it might be somebody in a department. So if you say, oh yes, and we're, you know, this really helping them to flourish, and you see them going like that, you know, by which I mean to thrive, and they go, like that. By which I mean it saves you $15 for every one that you spend. Phew, like that. So, but that's how we settled on that last thing. You're right, I don't use thrive. I don't come in as, I didn't call it applied thriving psychology or anything like that. So yeah, it's horses for courses, and different people have different things that stimulate them. But it's us being pragmatic. The Barb Fredrickson's word is the one that's really rung true with me. Just keep our eyes and ears open, because we really need to engage with government.
Can I just ask you, do you have a word that is a bit less over the top than thrive?
Yeah, I do like the word, I'm just mindful others may not. Excel, we want people to excel.
That sounds very academic.
Yeah.
How can you excel in character?
Yeah.
Or happiness?
Achieve.
Yeah, but I don't like achieve.
Yeah.
Thriving is much more than achievement, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a good thing to work on. Yeah.
I'm not saying I'm unhappy with it. I was just,
Yeah.
But it is different for every department, for every individual. What rings the bell will be different. If as a huge amount of branding, then behavioural science is what is attractive within government at the moment. But within our own clients, if we're a psychologist, a psychiatrist, or within our own operations or programs, it will be different there as well.
Just a quick question following on, I guess, from Paul's comment about the focus on well-being versus on the bottom line. I mean, in your experience, I guess there might be a risk that in sort of shifting over to focusing on ROI measures and outcomes, that they can be pretty rubbery, and there are lots of often heroic assumptions underlying, those things. I'm not saying that there were in any of the cases you cited, but I just wondered, just for your sense of whether that's a potential risk as well. Like, numbers are obviously powerful, but
yeah, it's quite an astute point, because if there's one thing that's opened the doors for me within government, it's been we've done this program, we've undertaken this program, we've implemented it, we've got these great results, and this upfront assessment or segmentation tool, whatever the terminology in the government there is. But when we then say, and it's been academically validated, suddenly the credibility goes up, because you can make statistics say anything. And we all know, even within academically validated measures, you can make the statistics say almost anything as well. But as soon as that's why it's so important that positive psychology has that branding as a science. That's what really attracted me to it. And in my first sentence I said, it's positive psychology not as a movement, not as an ethos, but as a science is what's absolutely critical for the credibility. So cutting through all of the branding, because that's really all I was talking about, was branding, which dirties science to some extent. But again, we've got to be pragmatic if we're to achieve our objectives. But yeah, you're right. It can be manipulated, but as long as we have this academic rigour, I've got papers written up and waiting for publication and what have you, and I send them off to them. Have you got any papers on this? I say yes, send them off, and then I ask them a little question in the next meeting. They obviously didn't read it, but suddenly they're really happy to invest in it because there was a paper. And it hadn't even been peer reviewed yet. I could have been talking about Mickey Mouse. So yeah, you're right. Again.
Can I just add something that I think relates to this question, that government is always a decade or two behind business and organisations. I think business and organisations are recognising the sort of thing that you're talking about. It's not about the bottom line. They're really into understanding that it's about people, it's about teams, it's about well-being. It's going to take government a lot longer to get back there. So I've seen some fantastic changes in organisations, recognising these things and speaking that language. But, maybe you're right that in government it's going to take a few more years.
very good point, Felicia.
I actually was going to follow on from exactly what James was saying about heroic assumptions. I was just wondering if there's some hidden costs here. So you mentioned a German study a while ago, and I saw a German study the other day that said, engagement is positively associated with happiness in most of the regions in Germany, but for the regions for which there are no opportunities, engagement is actually negatively associated with happiness. And so I'm wondering, with some of these programs here where you move people from pre-contemplation or contemplation through to action, but there's no opportunities to then fill that gap, is there potential to do some more damage than if you hadn't done anything
yes.
at all?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question. So, and a couple of perspectives on that. First of all, I think the content of our course could be half made up of crocheting as much as positive psychological interventions, but it's having a group of 8 to 12 unemployed people sitting in a room the first hour, really awkward and wishing that they weren't there. But that engagement with other people, all the studies show that in the first 6 weeks of being unemployed, you're actually a lot more sociable and your happiness actually goes up and depression goes down. But then when it kicks in, you haven't got a job or prospects after 6 weeks, then depression shoots up. But your isolation from others shoots up as well. So we all know the direct correlation between isolating oneself, lack of engagement. And did you mean engagement in terms of other humans or engagement in activities?
I meant engagement as in actively seeking to find work.
Well, yes, and that's a good point. You know, I said at the beginning we had a hunch that we shouldn't put everyone through the WAP program, or the ABS program as it's called now. And it wasn't so much a hunch as reading 30 years of studies on implementing the interventions from the stage of change. And you know, if you do the same thing with someone from an action stage of change, as you do with a pre-contemplator, you're going to alienate those people. So we said don't put action and preparation people, so people that genuinely want a job basically, in with the others that don't genuinely want a job for whatever reason. It might not be that they're bludgers, it might be that they're lacking confidence or hope, that sort of thing. Accidentally, Employment Services Queensland put about 1,000 action people and 1,000 preparation people through the course. The action people, in 6 months later, their likelihood of getting a job versus control action people had gone down significantly by about 7%. By being associated with these other people. They were already engaged, and us trying to make them engaged made them less engaged, the exact danger you were talking about. But the preparers, whom the literature suggested we shouldn't lump those in with people that didn't want a job, their increase in getting a job actually went up by the greatest amount. So it was a happy accident. We now don't put action people through it, but we put preparation people through the ABS workshop or the resilience workshops. So yes, it's an there are other factors about in-group and out-group that we've studied as well. I won't go into that because of time. Yeah, good question. So one last one? Well, it depends.
Oh, maybe.
Are you okay?
A little bit more, yeah.
No, tummy's rumbling.
Well, thank you for that. Great talk, very interesting. I have a science question. I'm interested in the actual ingredients of the program that people actually received, and you mentioned it could have been crochet or basket weaving or something that they could have done. What do you think are the key ingredients of why it's working?
Yes, well, being lazy, doing whatever's easiest, having low self-control and trying to avoid embarrassment, all the behavioural science suggestions of the way I'd act. I simply looked around for what had worked elsewhere and then contextualised that to our cohorts or the people we were targeting. What had worked elsewhere is school resiliency programs, so that's how I got familiar with those 21 comprehensive schools in Britain, but also the Penn Resiliency Program within the US military. And I had a look at what they did and then try to form that into a nice structured, I didn't have as long as you have in schools, so how can I really condense, can I look at these studies to see which seem to have the most impact? But then the other key problem, scientifically, is that if you've got a room of people that feel awkward or long-term unemployed and you ask them to do, say, one of the 3 gratitudes exercise, validated to really engage with people and improve well-being, etc., and proactivity for the next 6 weeks. If you ask a group of soldiers to do that, which they often did, is link arms or hold hands in the Helmand province before they go out on the tour of duty every day, they'd happily do it because they're soldiers, they do what they're told, or in a classroom. But if you've got long-term unemployed people, say, right, stand in a circle, let's hold hands, and go bugger off, and they'll be out of there. So the selection had those 2 things, what's worked elsewhere before, and then what would work in the context of the people we're dealing with. So in teaching mindfulness, it's a bit awkward, it won't engage everybody, so we have to think, how can we engage? Right, give us a list, here's a little exercise, list the coolest people in movies you've ever come across, and you get James Bond or Clint Eastwood, these sorts of people. Say, right, what do they all have in common? How do they react to a bomb going off or a disaster happening? And none of them run and scream and shout and go, oh my God, like that. You can't imagine James Bond doing that. They're cool and calm, they take a second to think and they respond rather than react. So you can see how you're teaching CBT and mindfulness in a different manner that's engaging for people. So we had to take the science and then not stretch it, but refine it a tiny bit for our particular customers. And we ended up with these 32 exercises that we know has worked elsewhere, and implemented, put it in a package of the 5 workshops.
But the question is that any better than...
You could have interrupted me much earlier on.
It's still not clear whether that's any better than mask reading.
Yes. Yeah. The bottom line is, for everything we've done, we've had a control where they're in the same offices, we're dealing with the same people, and doing what employment services have done for the last 20, 30 years.
But I think this
results.
question is about an active control, as opposed to a nothing, not doing anything control.
Well, they're having done to them all of the usual, which are basically action-oriented interventions.
It's like treatment as usual.
Yes.
Treatment as usual is still not an active control. It's still not taking what you think might be some of those ingredients and...
No, actually that's true, and it's necessary, but we've just not had time because the marketplace and government have liked it so much. They said, great, let's roll it out amongst all of these other thousands of people. Yeah, we should really see what, and that's the next part of my PhD, is what is it that's working within all of those 32 exercises? Or is it increasing their well-being, their grip? Is it that 2 of the exercises are getting 80% of the outcomes? Yeah, that's the proper scientific. And also financial way, because if I can do those 2 exercises in half a day instead of having to take 5 half days to get the same result, then that's great for the government as well, because it reduces their cost by 80%. So yeah, there's...
You may find that it's harder to convince rigorous scientists than government organizations.
Definitely. Brilliant. Thank you.
Is there any other sort of burning?
Yeah, can I ask one question?
Yeah.
I'm just looking up here at this 51% flourishing. What does that mean? 51%.
I could tell you the history, if you want, of how Seligman got to that, but maybe that's another time. And basically what happened was the day before the first IPPE meeting ever in Philadelphia, and we were having a board meeting, and my God, Seligman was bored. I saw, he was sitting next to me and looking absolutely miserable. And I said, do you want to see this poster that we're presenting? And it was all about our flourishing data from the European Social Survey. And it showed that Denmark was at 40%. And he looked at it and said, oh, okay. And he looked at it and said, I've got the mission for IPPA, 51% flourishing by 2051. How do you measure it? What is he talking about? It's a whole other matter. But that was how it happened, as quickly as that.
That's brilliant. But again, it's Seligman being pragmatic with a kind of a branding, a mobilising statement that all great statesmen have had. The logic and the reality of it is, hang on a minute, but yes, question. So it's your fault.
But just, I'm sure on everybody's behalf, I thank Darren enormously for a fantastic presentation. I mean, both in terms of the content and the style and the way you answer the questions and everything. But the other thing I just want to say is, he's going to be such a fantastic PhD student for us to have. I'm sure everyone's looking forward to that. But equally, I hope, I imagine, that you've been very impressed by the people here and look forward to a really fantastic interaction. Darren, thank you so much.